bedroom lights to 100%. Good morning. This is Heather Van Wild with Raindrop Works. I wasn't entirely planning on this stream right now. I'm still kind of in the middle of processing what I just read. Basically, what I'm going to be going through, and I fully expect this is going to be a very long read. It's a 66-page filing. The first half of it is what I'm particularly trying to get out. Like I said, this was a difficult read. This particular case, and I apologize for the water sound in the background. It's going to happen a few times because I'm going to be drinking a lot through this. Anyway, this is a case where Disability Rights Oregon is basically filing a lawsuit against the city, the county sheriff's office, the Oregon State Police, and the federal government for violations of the law that have happened in regards to the George Floyd protests, where a lot of the lawsuits have been focused so far have been dealing with press, legal observers, and protesters themselves. This one is focused specifically with the rights of people who are disabled. And full disclosure, while I'm not involved in this lawsuit at this time, I may end up, because I've had my own instances with discrimination based on disability doing my work with protests, so I may end up having a part in this case later. We don't know yet. So full disclosure on that. But yeah, this is something that is very close to me because of my own situations. And if you bear with me as we go through this, hopefully it'll help get things more understanding for everyone. Okay. So, yeah, this particular case, this is, the plaintiffs are Philip Wolf, Catalina Durden, Melissa Lewis, and Juniper Simonis individually, and then Disability Rights Oregon is a nonprofit advocacy corporation. They're suing the City of Portland Ted Wheeler in his official capacity both as the mayor and the police commissioner, Chief Chuck Lavelle of the Portland Police Bureau, Multnomah County, County Sheriff Michael Reese, Travis Hampton, as you'll see later, in his official capacity with the Oregon State Police, Chad Wolf, the acting head of DHS, and Donald Washington. I'm going to have to, we'll see later who he is. I forgot to double check that one, but I suspect he's got a lead position either with ICE or DHS, somewhere in there, in the federal law enforcement that we've been dealing with out here in Portland. So, as far as the introduction, this is a civil rights action to protect the constitutional and statutory rights of Oregonians with disabilities who are protesting in Portland, Oregon against systemic racism and police violence. This lawsuit seeks preliminary and permanent relief to stop local, state, and federal law enforcement from assaulting, brutalizing, and failing to reasonably accommodate people with disabilities during assemblies and protests. And as you'll find as we're going through this, there is a wide swath of violations that have been happening in so many ways that, you know, obvious ones and ones that most people wouldn't think about. In the wake of the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many other Black, Indigenous, or people of color by law enforcement, protesters have assembled in Portland, Oregon nearly every day for several months to demand police accountability and an end to systemic racism and other forms of oppression that Black, Indigenous, and people of color face in our country. Law enforcement has reacted to these protests with repeat and disproportionate displays of brute force, including disregarding the rights of people with disabilities. Just realized I need to... I'm sorry, I just realized I need to... One of the downsides to doing live streams when you're not used to it is realizing that you forgot little things. Okay. So in their attempts to disperse protests, law enforcement has deployed indiscriminate crowd control mechanisms, blanketing Portland's parks and streets with tear gas while discharging thousands of flashbang grenades, pepper balls, rubber bullets, as well as using their batons and fists to beat protesters and throw them to the ground. The burden of these tactics has fallen disproportionately on protesters and others with disabilities, who receive little or no notice or opportunity to comply before law enforcement uses overwhelming force. In fact, protesters are often brutalized even as they attempt to comply with police instructions while informing officers of their disabilities. Defendants have often targeted people with disabilities for harassment and violence in retaliation for exercising their constitutional rights. They have told people with disabilities that they should not attend protests at all. Local, state, and federal law enforcement have failed to establish policies designed to afford people with disabilities the same opportunity to avoid law enforcement harm as those without disabilities, including, for example, adequately warning protesters before attempting to take actions to disperse a crowd, making sure that there are clear routes of escape before using tear gas or similar measures, and generally giving protesters a reasonable opportunity to comply with orders. Police Bureau, Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, Oregon State Police, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Marshal Service, and the individual defendants have violated the rights of people with disabilities in their responses to protests against police brutality, chilling the exercise of their constitutional right to assemble and protest. Defendants' actions violate the Americans with Disabilities Act, the 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the First, Fourth, Fifth, and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, subjecting them to unnecessary harm and discrimination, abridging their freedom of speech, subjecting them to excessive force, and denying them due process and equal protection of the law. Plaintiffs bring this action to vindicate the fundamental rights of people with disabilities. Where the jurisdiction and venue is where they go over why they're allowed to bring the case in this particular court, which is the federal court in the District of Oregon. This court has subject matter jurisdiction over plaintiff's claims pursuant to 28 U.S.C. 1331A and 1343 because plaintiffs allege violations of rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the ADA. This court has jurisdiction over plaintiffs' claims for injunctive and declaratory relief pursuant to 28 U.S.C. 2201 and 2202 and Rule 65 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. Venue is proper in the District of Oregon pursuant to the same, because a substantial part of the events or admissions giving rise to plaintiffs' claims occurred in the District of Oregon, and because defendants are subject to personal jurisdiction in the District of Oregon. Basically, almost everyone involved in this case is in Oregon. As far as the parties, plaintiff Philip Wolf has been a resident of Portland, Oregon since 2010, including at all times relevant to this lawsuit. Philip has been deaf since birth and communicates through American Sign Language, or ASL. Philip is a qualified person with a disability within the meaning of the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act. Philip has a lengthy history of activism, including participation in demonstrations for the Me Too movement, the March for Our Lives, Actions for Climate Change, and Opposing War, chairing Portland's Community Oversight Advisory Board, and running for Portland City Council to represent the needs of the entire community, including people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Philip regularly attends the protests against police brutality and continues to be subject to discrimination and harm by defendants. Plaintiff Catalina Katie Durden has been a resident of Portland, Oregon since 2008, including at all times relevant to this lawsuit. Katie lost her vision when she was 4 years old from optic nerve damage and is legally blind. She's a qualified person with disability within the meaning of the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act. She initially monitored protests online out of fear of harm stemming from defendants' treatment of people with disabilities, particularly their excessive use of force. However, she has attended protests regularly since late July as an independent member of the press who records the protests in 360-degree sound for people with low vision and others. She typically uses a guide dog to navigate, but has instead used a reflective red and white cane at protests for fear of harm to her service dog. She continues to be subject to discrimination and harm by defendants. Plaintiff Melissa Lewis has been a resident of Portland, Oregon nearly her entire life, including at all times relevant to this lawsuit. She is a person with both photosensitive epilepsy and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a connective tissue disorder that results in susceptibility to soft tissue tears and slow healing from these injuries. As a result, Melissa is not able to run or move quickly. Melissa is a qualified person with a disability within the meaning of the ADA and Rehabilitation Act. Melissa has regularly attended the protests as a freelance journalist as part of Cascadia Photo-G and sells footage to ABC, Daily Beast, Willamette Weekly, and other local news media. She continues to be the subject to discrimination and harm by defendants. I do want to point out, Ms. Durden and Ms. Lewis are both press. We actually, as press, had additional protections before this lawsuit was filed, where, as a result of a previous restraining order, that we were supposed to be given a wide berth. And instead, as you'll find, these people were, if not given indifference to them being press, they were actively targeted for being press. Plaintiff Juniper Simmons has been a resident of Portland, Oregon since August 2015, including at all times relevant to this lawsuit. Juniper is living with complex PTSD as a result of a lifetime mistreatment due to their gender identity as a non-binary transgender person. For Juniper, PTSD manifests as obsessive-compulsive tendencies, hypervigilance, panic attacks, and dissociative episodes. Juniper is a qualified individual with a disability within the meaning of the ADA and Rehabilitation Act. They are a data scientist, an ecologist, and a progressive activist. They have been regularly attending the protests in Portland with their service dog, Wallace, since June. They continue to be subject to discrimination and harm by defendants. Plaintiff Disability Rights Oregon is the federally mandated protection and advocacy system for the state of Oregon. Specifically, DRO has the authority to investigate instances of abuse, neglect, and rights violations, and pursue administrative, legal, and other appropriate remedies to ensure the protection of people with disabilities. DRO's institutional mission is to promote and defend the rights of all people with disabilities or those perceived to have disabilities in the state of Oregon. DRO's vital mission, however, has been frustrated by defendants' policies and practices which systematically violate the rights of Oregonians, particularly those with disabilities. DRO has had to divert resources from its organizational mission to address defendants' violations of the law, redirecting staff from their work on other matters, and the expenditure of scarce financial resources on issues relating to the rights of protesters with disabilities. These efforts include responding to inquiries on behalf of protesters with disabilities since the beginning of the protests in May 2020, drafting and disseminating related Know Your Rights information, and drafting multiple requests for accommodation on behalf of protesters with disabilities directed to defendants. Moreover, DRO's members have been impacted by defendants' violations of the law. Because DRO is the federally designated protection and advocacy system for Oregon, every person with disabilities in the state is a member of DRO. DRO represents the interests of all Oregonians with disabilities, including those seeking to exercise their right to protest. Each of the named plaintiffs is a constituent of DRO and falls within DRO's mandate to ensure that the rights of people with disabilities are protected. DRO seeks injunctive relief only. Now for the defendants. Defendant City of Portland, the city, is a municipality located in Multnomah County in the state of Oregon. As a local governmental entity, the city is subject to suit under 42 U.S.C. 1983, which you'll often hear these called 1983 claims. The ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Defendant Ted Wheeler is both the elected mayor of the city and the police commissioner for the Portland Police Bureau. Mayor Wheeler has supervisory responsibility for the actions of the city. As the commissioner, Mayor Wheeler is responsible for the actions of the PPB, including approval of policies and practices instituted by the chief of police. He is sued in his professional capacity, or his official capacity. Defendant Chuck Lavelle is the chief of police for the Portland Police Bureau. He is the official policymaker for the Portland Police. He is sued in his official capacity. Defendant Multnomah County is a political subdivision of the state of Oregon. As a local governmental entity, the county is subject to suit under 1983, the ADA, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Defendant Michael Reese is the sheriff for Multnomah County. He is the official policymaker for the County Sheriff's Department, which is the county's law enforcement agency, and he is sued in his official capacity. Defendant Travis Hampton, Superintendent of the Oregon State Police. Portland Police, OSP, and other defendants have closely coordinated their responses to the protests, and, on information and belief, OSP has taken a leading role in responding to certain protests in Portland. Superintendent Hampton is sued in his official capacity. Defendant Chad Wolf is the acting Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS. They are a federal agency of the United States with purview over Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. DHS and ICE have both actively participated in the response to the Portland protests. ICE has sent its BORTAC, or Border Patrol Tactical Unit, the paramilitary arm of the United States Border Patrol, and DHS has sent its own, often unmarked agents to the protests. DHS has also deputized local law enforcement to enforce federal law. Acting Director Wolf is sued in his official and individual capacity. Defendant Donald Washington is the official in charge of the U.S. Marshal Service, which has acted in concert with the DHS agents and the other defendants in response to the protests, and he is sued in his individual and official capacity. Does 1 through 100 are other governmental agencies and individual officers, agents, and employees of defendants who violated the rights of plaintiffs, but whose identities are unknown at this time. This complaint will be amended with leave of the court after they've been identified in discovery. Plaintiffs are informed and believe that each of the defendants is the agent, ostensible agent, alter ego, master, servant, trustor, trustee, employer, employee, representative, affiliate, partner, and or associate, or a similar capacity of each of the other defendants, and at all times acting and performing or failing to perform within the course and scope of each capacity, and with the authorization, consent, permission, or ratification of each of the other defendants. That's all the background with the players and everything. Factual background. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others led to protests against racism and police brutality. On March 13, 2020, Louisville police officers Jonathan Mattingly, Brett Hankinson, and Miles Cosgrove killed Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old black woman, after mistakenly raiding her apartment. Only one officer, Brett Hankinson, was fired as a result of the incident. Ms. Taylor's death led to large-scale demonstrations in the spring and summer of 2020 as the case drew more attention. On May 25, 2020, Derek Chauvin, a white police officer with the Minneapolis Police Department, killed George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, after responding to a report that Mr. Floyd bought cigarettes with a counterfeit $20 bill. Officer Chauvin knelt on George Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes. This brutal act was captured on a video and widely disseminated. During those 8 minutes, Mr. Floyd repeated what has become a shockingly familiar phrase uttered by far too many people of color, including Eric Gardner, Javier Ambler, Manuel Ellis, and Elijah McClain. "I can't breathe." Officer Chauvin and his fellow officers ignored his pleas. In response to the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and the historic and continued police brutality and violence against black people, indigenous people, and other people of color, protests have erupted across the country demanding accountability and even a complete reimagining of the community approach to public safety. These protests have too often been met with their own wave of brutality, including the use of tear gas, flashbang grenades, pepper balls, and rubber bullets. The defendants routinely utilize brutal tactics against Portland protesters. The use of these weapons and other brutal tactics have been on full display in Portland, Oregon, where defendants have used them to disperse groups of largely peaceful protesters, legal observers, and members of the press. Defendants' actions have already deprived people of their rights, caused countless injuries, and sparked multiple state and federal lawsuits and court-ordered injunctions. Protesters in Portland have assembled almost every day since May 29, 2020, to protest the systemic use of violence against people of color, including at the hands of Portland police and other law enforcement agencies in Oregon. As a matter of public record, Portland police have killed, among others, and I apologize if I mispronounce names here, Keonce Hayes, Terrell Johnson, Aaron Campbell, Patrick Kimmons, Darius Johnson, Kendra James, and Coben Hendrickson. Mr. Hendrickson was the 5th person in a mental health crisis killed by officers of the Portland Police Bureau in 2019 alone. During these protests, people with disabilities have been routinely discriminated against, targeted, brutalized with excessive force, and denied their freedom of speech and right to due processes and equal protection of the law. The first section specifically talks about defendants discriminating against people who are deaf or hard of hearing. At protests, including by failing to provide effective communications to protesters and others. This is one of the things that I personally dealt with when I was on the ground. Is they would use the LRAD to send out commands, and not only would protesters drown out the LRAD so I couldn't hear what was being said, but even in a normal situation, I do have hearing issues that would make understanding what is being said difficult at best. And the only other option would be to be glued to my phone at their Twitter account to see what they said on Twitter, which is not a reasonable option to me. It presumes that everyone who has disabilities also happens to have a smartphone that they're willing to bring out to a protest to watch Twitter to see what the cops have to say. And you point out that usually seems to only apply to Portland Police. Other agencies I haven't seen really doing that. Anyway, defendants have failed to provide effective and accessible communications about law enforcement or other activities at protests. Defendants have routinely failed to communicate orders to disperse, including instructions for doing so, warnings about imminent use of force, and declarations of unlawful assemblies and riots. When defendants have communicated orders, they have only done so orally. As a result, people who are deaf or hard of hearing have been subjected to egregious uses of force for failing to comply with orders and warnings they never received. This is true for members of DRO and Philip. Philip has been subjected to this use of force on numerous occasions. On May 31st, at around 10:30 or 11 p.m., Portland police officers fired flashbang grenades into a crowd of thousands of people without any warning accessible to people who were deaf or hard of hearing. Flashbang grenades emitted extremely loud noise and bright lights aimed at disorienting people. For people who are deaf or hard of hearing, flashbang grenades are particularly disorienting and can cause additional hearing damage. Deaf and hard of hearing people often rely heavily on their vision, along with residual hearing if applicable, to access and move through the world around them. Flashbang grenades can cause deaf and hard of hearing people to lose their residual hearing temporarily or permanently, and to experience a temporary but devastating impact on their ability to see and maintain physical balance. They may also experience severe ringing in their ears. The combination of these various factors leads to extreme disorientation and an unsafe situation for deaf and hard of hearing people. The Portland Police's use of flashbang grenades and other force that evening caused a stampede in the crowd, putting Philip and others, including those with disabilities that impact mobility, at significant risk of injury. Philip and Philip's friends, who are also deaf, desperately tried to hold hands and stay together amid the chaos. Portland police officers then fired tear gas into the crowd, causing Philip and others to cough and Philip's eyes to burn and water profusely. As a result, Philip was unable to see or hear what was happening in an already chaotic environment. Philip was fortunate to have escaped the crowd without significant physical injury, although Philip was left dizzy, nauseous, lethargic, and dazed from the exposure to tear gas and overall experience. Philip was not so fortunate on other occasions. On June 19, 2020, for example, Philip, like many others, attended a protest at the Multnomah County, Oregon Justice Center in downtown Portland. That evening, as on other occasions, Portland police officers shot tear gas canisters and flashbang grenades indiscriminately into the crowd. No accessible warnings were ever given to persons with disabilities. Philip perceived that officers began to fire out of nowhere, and then Philip felt a sharp, searing pain as a flashbang grenade hit Philip in the back. Again, he's hard of hearing, so this just came out of nowhere. Officers shouted at protesters as they continued to fire indiscriminately into the crowd and strike protesters with batons even as the crowd began to disperse. Philip was unable to understand what the officers said. It felt like a war zone to Philip. On July 22nd, 2020, after DHS officers established a presence in the city, Philip attended a rally a few blocks away from the Justice Center and later on another event happening on 4th Street. Philip observed Portland police officers and federal agents work in tandem to disperse the large group, with both agencies firing tear gas and flashbang grenades into the crowd. Neither Portland Police nor DHS gave any accessible warning to Philip. Philip brought an interpreter that evening who informed Philip that the authorities gave an oral warning that the event had become unlawful. However, PPB and DHS did not give Philip sufficient time to disperse before using force. Philip could not avoid exposure to tear gas, coughed, and became dizzy. A friend who is deaf and blind and who accompanied Philip that evening was terrified. On other occasions, Philip was forced to leave protests far earlier than Philip would have chosen because defendants' communication was inaccessible to Philip, causing an unavoidable risk of violence and arrest by defendants. When Philip articulated concerns about accessibility to Portland police officers, the officers told Philip not to attend protests because the inaccessibility made it unsafe. Again, the police's response to how do we make these protests accessible to people with disabilities was, don't come out here. As discussed below, Philip also brought these concerns directly to Mayor Wheeler, who also failed to make reasonable accommodations available. Portland Police's use of tear gas on Philip should have been avoided through effective communication. Philip has had recurring headaches since mid-August because of the tear gas. Phillip's existing PTSD has been exacerbated as a result of the war zone-like environment and has experienced severe anxiety, insomnia, fatigue, hypervigilance, night terrors, and other symptoms. Philip has attempted to meaningfully address Portland Police's disability discriminations through the years. In 2012, Philip filed a lawsuit challenging Portland Police's failure to provide accommodations to people who are deaf or hard of hearing when responding to calls for service. When Philip reported a domestic violence situation and requested an interpreter, the police responded without an interpreter, refused to get one, spoke only to Phillip's partner, and as a result did nothing. In other words, usually if someone calls the police about a domestic violence situation, they're either a bystander or the victim. And it sounds like, in this case, Philip was the victim. And for the police to come out, not talk to the victim, talk to the alleged aggressor, and only take their side of the story, that's shoddy police work on so many different levels. After the lawsuit settled, Philip served as a role player for the Department of Public Safety Standards and Training, attempting to train Portland police officers on how to effectively work with and serve people who are deaf or hard of hearing. During the 6 months Philip worked in that capacity, Philip saw firsthand Portland Police's resistance to change and to accommodating people with disabilities. A resistance that continues to this day and makes this lawsuit necessary. For 8 years, this person has been fighting to protect the rights of people who are deaf and hard of hearing. And for 8 years of consistent work, Portland Police has decided they don't want to do anything. At no time did Philip observe any discussion of the need to provide American Sign Language interpreters, nor did Philip see any real effort by Portland Police and the city to otherwise implement the settlement from his lawsuit. In September 2020, city officials informed plaintiffs' counsel that a policy on effective communication has been in draft form for the last 2 years. And later on, I believe there is a reference to the policy that is talked about. Defendants discriminate against people who are blind and low vision. Defendants discriminate against people who are blind or low vision at protests, including by subjecting them to excessive force and by failing to provide clear and consistent directions, such as orders to disperse and sufficient opportunity to comply. Plaintiff Durden primarily reads Braille and primarily uses the guide dog for mobility. Katie has concerns about tear gas and other forms of indiscriminate violence by law enforcement, and she is concerned that her guide dog would be injured if she brought the dog to a protest. When she attends protests, Katie relies on her cane and a sighted guide, i.e. a sighted individual who can safely lead her through crowds and over uneven ground. Katie is an independent journalist and attends protests with sound recording equipment to develop 360-degree audio recordings that she edits and publishes on SoundCloud. When attending a protest as a member of the press, Katie wears a press badge and a helmet with press written on it. Tiny plug, the press pass, if she's still using the same one, is one that I provided for her. On Friday, July 24th, 2020, Katie attempted a nighttime march with her friend Jacob Hanning, another journalist who also served as her sighted guide for the evening. Katie and Jacob both wore full-face gas masks and helmets. Jacob's helmet also had the word press written on it in block letters. As an independent journalist, Jacob was live streaming the events of the evening on Periscope. During the course of the evening, Katie and Jacob were tear gassed several times, but thanks to their gas masks, they only suffered minor irritation. Katie and Jacob spent the majority of the evening near the fence surrounding the Justice Center. At no point were Katie and Jacob within 15 feet of the fence. Local and federal agents were stationed on the other side of the fence, firing tear gas and flashbangs into the crowd. And remember, other side of the fence, this is a fence that most likely was the one set up at the federal courthouse. Very secure fence, and they were just shooting through and over, and it felt almost like a video game. Oh. At approximately 1:58 a.m., Katie and Jacob were standing approximately 30 feet from the fence when Jacob filmed the protesters standing between them and the fence. They were standing still, and Katie had her cane visible in front of her. Katie and Jacob heard a series of loud pops and felt several objects hit them hard in the side and legs. Jacob led Katie away from the area as quickly as he could, and they moved to the next street corner. Once there, they examined their clothing and realized that law enforcement had shot them with pepper balls, paintball-sized pellets filled with olearizine capsaicin, OC, the same substance as pepper spray. The impacts were hard enough to leave a large welt just below Katie's hip. Again, this is, not only is this a problem because you're shooting protesters with disabilities, or people at a protest with disabilities, but this was also a violation of a court order saying not to target press. On August 6, 2020, Katie was attempting another nighttime protest with her cane and sighted guides, this time in southeast Portland. Portland police declared an unlawful assembly within 15 minutes of Katie's arrival and quickly declared the assembly a riot shortly thereafter. Portland police bull rushed the protesters, shoving them and hitting them with their batons to drive them in a chosen direction while yelling at them to run. You usually don't want to ask a person who has trouble seeing to run. Katie, led by her sighted guides, was moving as fast as she could, but she was shoved in the back by police, lost her balance, and skidded on her knees. To get away from the crush of people, Katie's guides led her up a flight of stairs. It was narrow enough that they had to move single file without her guides to help her. Katie ran face first into a metal pole. Katie has suffered persistent knee pain since the incident on August 5th, 2020. On August 7th, 2020, Katie attended a nighttime protest outside the Kelly building in southeast Portland together with 3 sighted guides. The Kelly building is Kelly Penumbra, which is usually a significant county sheriff presence there, but at protests it's also been handled by local police. After approximately 3 hours, Portland police declared an unlawful assembly. At approximately 12:30 a.m., the police bull rushed the protesters. Police shoved Katie while yelling at her to move. Only after she identified herself as a member of the press and informed the police that they were being recorded, did officers stop actively pushing her? Again, remember, as part of the court orders in other cases, press are exempt from dispersal orders so that they can do their job of documenting inside an area where the police are trying to keep people out of. The idea with it is, if there's no one there to document what is to keep the cops from doing whatever they want and having no accountability, no one to say this is the truth of what happened. So, at the same time as the bull rush, officers using the long-range acoustic device, or the LRAD, orally instructed protesters to disperse to the east. Over the next 20 minutes, the LRAD instructions changed several times. Protesters were instructed to disperse to the east, then to the east or south, then solely to the south, and then finally to the west. Even the officers making the announcement seemed confused about the directions they were providing. On September 18th, 2020, Katie attended a nighttime protest in downtown Portland with two-sided guides. Between 200 and 300 protesters were gathered approximately 2 blocks from the ICE detention facility to protest the forced sterilization of women in ICE custody. Katie normally wears a full-face gas mask to protests. On this particular night, however, she had traded masks with a sighted guide whose goggles were broken. Katie was left with only a respirator and very little eye protection. Katie believed that because the ban on CS gas that Mayor Wheeler had issued on September 10, 2020, the chances of tear gas exposure were lower than they had been previously. When Katie and her guides arrived at the protest, DHS agents were in a riot line in front of the protesters. Federal agents attempted to push the crowd back several times without significant success. While DHS agents formed a riot line to the south, Portland police officers arrived, declared an unlawful assembly, and swept from the west to the north, blocking egress for protesters in multiple directions. Mayor Wheeler's ban on CS gas, however, only applied to the Portland police and not to federal agencies. Thus, DHS agents were free to use tear gas to disperse the crowd, and they did so vigorously, firing numerous canisters of tear gas into the crowd along with hundreds of rounds of pepper balls and other munitions. Interspersed with the tear gas canisters were numerous flashbangs. One of these flashbangs went off so close to Katie that she saw the flash with her limited vision through closed eyes, and she felt acute pain and ringing in her ears. As federal agents blocked her path from the south, and Portland police pushed in from the north and west, officers from different agencies ordered Katie to disperse in different directions. Even for someone who is sighted, that's going to be confusing as all get out. For someone who has difficulty seeing, that's a nightmare. Katie's air was saturated with tear gas and OC powder, and it was nearly impossible to escape the protest area without being affected. The tear gas and pepper spray caused Katie significant discomfort and pain. Katie had her eyes rinsed 3 times that night, only to be reaffected by tear gas and OC powder each time. Dispersal orders and excessive force are often disorienting for Katie, who cannot read street signs without assistance. Katie, like many blind people, navigates primarily using cardinal directions such as north, south, east, and west. Cardinal directions, however, are not useful to Katie after she becomes disoriented by law enforcement's use of force. On Saturday, September 26, 2020, Katie attended a daytime Proud Boys rally to record speeches and a nighttime protest at the Justice Center. At both events, Katie's companion, Jack Tadilla, was her primary sighted guide. Their friend, Declan Hood, served as an additional sighted guide at the nighttime protest. Katie also had her cane with her. Katie, Jack, and Declan Hood walked arm in arm through the nighttime protest while Jack took video and Katie made audio recordings. Jack was wearing a yellow high-visibility jacket, and Katie wore her bright blue helmet labeled Press. And I've seen her helmet. It is definitely bright blue. Around midnight, Portland police declared an unlawful assembly and rushed the protesters. As the crowd moved backwards with their hands up, police shoved people to the ground and beat them with batons. The retreat became a stampede as people tried to escape the police. Katie, Jack, and Declan Hood were caught in the crowd moving backwards. Katie and Jack repeatedly and loudly stated that Katie was blind and a member of the press. As Jack and Declan Hood turned around to help Katie backwards, officers shoved them, knocking all three to the ground. Officers surrounded and arrested Jack, while others continued to strike Katie and Declan Hood with their batons. And it looks like they were still on the ground when they were getting beat. Through the limited vision in her left eye, Katie saw the batons, which hit her in the helmet, chest, and shoulders. Declan Hood dragged Katie away to prevent her from being injured, and Katie heard Jack screaming her name. Katie has relied on Jack as her primary sighted guide at recent protests, and the two have formed a close bond. Thus, Jack's arrest was particularly traumatic for Katie. Declan Hood and Katie escaped the stampede and were able to locate a group of their friends. Katie and the group of friends waited for Jack to get released from custody at 5 a.m. When their personal effects were returned to Jack, everything, including all of their and Katie's electronic equipment, had been doused in hand sanitizer. They don't say if the equipment was damaged, but it's a very decent chance that the gear was damaged, if not destroyed, by the police doing that. Katie suffered numerous physical injuries from her experiences at the Portland protests, including heavy bruising and pain across her body. Repeated exposure to physical violence at the hands of state and federal law enforcement has taken a severe emotional toll on Katie. Katie's therapist of 8 years indicates that she is displaying symptoms of active trauma and PTSD. She's barely sleeping, has persistent nightmares, and experiences brief but repeated dissociative episodes. Katie's job and classwork have suffered because she has found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. Katie knows the toll that attending the protests is taking on her, but has no intention of quitting. And defendants also discriminate against people with mobility disabilities, which is another significant one for me personally. Those who see me when I'm out in the field, I use a walker. I use one almost all the time when I leave the house because of risk of falling. And in my particular case, with the walker, it will only allow me to move so fast, and it's at best a brisk walking pace in perfect situations. What's talked about here is a completely different circumstance, but the same idea. Defendants have systematically discriminated against protesters, members of the press, and others with mobility disabilities at protests. Defendants and their officers and agents routinely use force against people at protests, even those who are attempting to comply with law enforcement orders. They fail to ensure that people with mobility disabilities have safe routes of egress from protests, and even block people with mobility disabilities from leaving. For example, because of Melissa's connective tissue disorder, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, she is unable to run without risking severe injury and lasting pain. Like countless others, as a result of her disability and defendants' failures to accommodate, Melissa has been subjected to tear gas, flashbang grenades, baton strikes, rubber bullets, pepper balls, shoving, and other unnecessary uses of force by defendants on numerous occasions, simply because her disability prevents her from complying as quickly as demanded by defendants. Also, Melissa is another well-known independent journalist. So, again, like several of the other people in this case, they're supposed to be exempt from dispersal orders, so there was, once they know that we're pressed, there was no reason for them to continue trying to shove us away. The first time Melissa was subjected to use of force on account of her disability was May 31st, 2020. On May 31st, 2020, Melissa was in a crowd of protesters when she saw Portland police officers in full riot gear use indiscriminate force against protesters for behavior as minor as shaking the fence around the Justice Center. Portland police provide verbal warnings before using force, but the crowd was so tightly packed that Melissa was physically unable to leave before police fired tear gas and flashbang grenades into the crowd. Unable to run or see because of the burning pain from the gas, Melissa stumbled home. On June 12, 2020, Melissa was in the crowd again when Portland police officers reacted to shaking of the fence around the Justice Center with overwhelming force without providing sufficient notice for her to disperse. Although Melissa was not shaking the fence, her hands were raised and she posed no threat to officers. Portland police shot Melissa in the leg from less than 3 feet away with a foam baton. I've done research previously on those rounds, and my understanding is they're not supposed to be used from that close. Because of risk of serious injury. And in this case, in severe pain, Melissa went to the emergency room. As a result of the unnecessary use of force and Melissa's susceptibility to injury, she was diagnosed with IT band syndrome, a syndrome affecting the ligaments that connect the hip to the shin. Afterwards, she had to take opiates to control the pain, and her leg could not bear weight. She needed to use crutches for 2 weeks and later a cane. Even now, Melissa must wear leg braces every day. Before, she only required them occasionally. Melissa was unable to attend protests for weeks after her injury, but she did continue to monitor the protests online via live stream. On June 19th, for example, Melissa observed defendants bull rush protesters without warning. By mid-July, Melissa had recovered enough to start attending the protests 4 days a week. On or about July 16th, 2020, Melissa observed Bortak and other federal defendants working in tandem with Portland police officers. Bortak agents fired tear gas and flashbang grenades into a group of protesters assembled at Chapman Square Park before rushing protesters in an effort that appeared to be coordinated with Portland police. Portland police officers and federal agents stood shoulder to shoulder as they dispersed the crowd. Melissa received only seconds of notice before the rush. She was forced to run for several blocks, resulting in shin splints and enormous ongoing pain. Melissa's experiences had led her to feel fear of law enforcement violence resulting from defendants' failure to accommodate her disability by giving sufficient notice. On many occasions, this fear has caused Melissa to leave protests earlier than she wished. On or about July 19th, 2020, Melissa left the protest early rather than face violence and law enforcement bull rushes. After Melissa left, DHS agents gave only a minute's notice before chasing protesters from 3rd to 14th Street. That distance takes me a good 10-15 minutes to walk. On August 7th, 2020, Melissa attended a protest of the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. Melissa was conspicuously marked with her press credentials and helmet labeled press. That evening, Portland police officers declared an unlawful assembly and bull rushed the gathered protesters, striking them with batons and fists. Although Melissa was lawfully on the sidewalk with a group of 8 to 10 other members of the press, police yelled at the group to move. As Melissa attempted to comply, an officer struck her with a baton in the back of her head just below her helmet, where her neck and head meet. The officer shoved Melissa hard for not moving quickly enough. Melissa went to the hospital the next day and received a cervical collar neck brace. Her CT scan revealed inflammation and a hematoma. She was lucky on that. That could have paralyzed someone. On or about August 9th, 2020, Melissa attended a protest at the Justice Center. Multnomah County Sheriff's deputies forcibly removed her from the area along with other press and protesters so officers would have a clear path to the parking lot. The deputies provided no warning before they began screaming at the group to move, striking them, and pushing them hard with batons. Melissa complied with deputies' instructions, and she was on the sidewalk, where a temporary restraining order said she had a right to be. Nonetheless, the deputies pulled Melissa by her backpack, shoved her shoulders, and struck her ribs with a baton for not moving quickly enough. But Melissa feared that she might twist her ankle, or worse, if she moved any faster. When Melissa told the deputies she was complying, they told her to turn around and stop filming. At no time did the deputies communicate to Melissa, other members of the press, or the protesters where they should be. Instead, the deputies pushed, pulled, and jabbed them with batons. On or about August 21st, 2020, Melissa was at an action in front of the ICE detention center in Portland when DHS and other federal agents fired tear gas, flashbang grenades, and pepper balls at peaceful protesters. Melissa was conspicuously marked as a member of the press and had no one in her immediate vicinity. Nevertheless, DHS agents intentionally threw a tear gas canister at her, hitting her in the head. Melissa went to the emergency room where she was diagnosed with a concussion and a large hematoma. On September 6, 2020, Melissa was present on the 100th night of protests in Portland. She saw law enforcement, including Portland Police and Oregon State Police, act in concert to quash a protest in Ventura Park before it even began. Protesters planned to march from Ventura Park to Portland Police's East Precinct and back to the park. Some of the protesters then planned to return to the precinct for a separate direct action later that night. However, Portland Police and Oregon State Police announced that the protesters were not allowed to leave the park. A single person in the crowd, suspected to have been a right-wing agitator, then threw Molotov cocktails, which struck protesters and journalists over 100 feet away from the line of riot police that had already formed. They landed nowhere near the police. In response to the single person's actions, Portland Police and Oregon State Police launched a flurry of tear gas canisters at the crowd in the park. Basically a kettle. They gassed a kettle. For several hours, officers repeatedly prevented protesters from dispersing. At approximately 1:15 a.m., Portland Police announced that the park had closed at 10 p.m. The police charged, taking down protesters, medics, and members of the press at a full sprint. Melissa maneuvered behind the riot line, where she filmed the police tackling a protester. Melissa heard another officer yell that the park was closed. As Melissa began to leave, an officer tackled her. Melissa attempted to pick up her camera and other belongings, politely telling the officer that she was moving as quickly as she could. Melissa was only 3 feet away when the officer tackled her again. She finally made it back to the press line, dazed and winded after being knocked down twice. Another journalist saw her and said, "He just kept pushing you over." Melissa went to the ER. She was diagnosed with whiplash and contusions on her left shoulder blade, knees, and thorax. On September 18, 2020, Melissa attended a protest near ICE headquarters. DHS agents fired a barrage of tear gas, hundreds of pepper balls, and stingers. Stingers being basically like rubber bullets. Melissa used a door to shield herself, but she was shot in the leg 7 times. Later that night, Portland Police and DHS agents coordinated to surround protesters, and Melissa stood on the tailgate of a truck to film them. DHS and BORTAC agents used more tear gas than Melissa had ever seen, blanketing several blocks, and Portland police officers began making arrests. One officer grabbed Melissa by her backpack and threw her off the truck, knocking the wind out of her and causing severe pain as her back and hips hit the curb. Melissa went to the emergency room and was prescribed oxycodone for her continuing pain. On September 23, 2020, Portland police declared a riot after someone set a small fire. Officers pushed protesters from the Multnomah County Detention Center to Broadway Street. Portland police officers harassed protesters who tried to leave, and Melissa filmed them. A person of color approached to ask the police to let the protesters out. Melissa and Scott, another journalist, stepped up to film the interaction. Melissa and Scott were in the crosswalk and were not interfering with police. Portland police officer number 148051, ignoring the protesters, approached aggressively and screamed at Scott to move back and get on the sidewalk. Scott and Melissa immediately began backing up. They were only feet from the sidewalk. Melissa told the officer that she was trying to comply, but the officer shoved her forcefully. Melissa stumbled, her foot caught the curb, and she fell hard. Melissa felt a snap and a pop inside her ankle. The intense pain stole her breath. She thought that the officer had torn the stitching surrounding the internal brace that prevents her tendons and ligaments from tearing. Medics arrived, bracing her foot and ankle and calling for an evacuation team to take her to the emergency room. It's worth pointing out here that the medics are almost guaranteed to be community medics, not anyone associated with any government or social service program. These are protesters who are donating their time to try to help keep other people safe. At the emergency room, Melissa learned that she had likely torn tendons and ligaments in the lateral or posterior ankle, where she had previously had multiple surgeries. She received a referral to an orthopedic surgeon. Although Melissa was in agonizing pain, the emergency room could not provide pain medication because of strict opioid restrictions. Remember, this, just the week, 5 days before, she had just been given oxycodone for a previous fall. The constant stress and fear has taken an emotional toll on Melissa. Since she began attending protests regularly, Melissa has lost approximately 30 pounds. Defendants discriminate against people with photosensitive epilepsy. Defendants discriminate against people with epilepsy at protests. Defendants' use of strobe lights is a significant trigger for people with photosensitive epilepsy. Use of strobes disorients protesters and stymies identification of police involved in brutal actions. In addition to her EDS, Melissa also has photosensitive epilepsy. Law enforcement has subjected her repeatedly to strobe lights, many times intentionally and after she told the officers about her epilepsy. It's fairly common knowledge. People with a history of epilepsy don't handle strobes or flashing lights very well. That can sometimes include just police or ambulance lights themselves. When Melissa is confronted with a strobe light, she must turn around, find a dark corner, and put her head down to avert a grand mal or petit mal seizure. Even brief exposures to strobe lights can induce a petit mal or absence seizure. When confronted with a strobe light, Melissa becomes impossibly tired, loses time, and can become stuck, so that she has to be pulled away by her companions before a grand mal seizure occurs. A friend must tell her when the strobe is stopped and it is safe to turn around. Melissa's worst possible fear is having a grand mal seizure at a protest. A petit mal seizure would cause her to briefly lose consciousness. A grand mal seizure would cause her to lose consciousness, collapse, and experience muscle spasms. And we have seen a number of instances of police arresting people that are having seizures and not providing any care other than maybe putting them on their side to make sure they don't suffocate on vomit. Melissa normally has 2 petit mal seizures per month. After persistent exposure to use of strobe lights by law enforcement, Melissa has experienced 2 grand mal seizures in the month of July, in addition to absence seizures. Although defendants have used strobe lights pervasively, one officer has repeatedly gone out of his way to use strobe lights against Melissa, specifically after Melissa and others repeatedly told him that she has photosensitive epilepsy. The officer, PPB officer 1004013, with helmet number 22, is so notorious for brute force that a parody account was created for him on Twitter. He only appears to use the strobe on Melissa, targeting her specifically because of her known epilepsy. Officer 1004013 has used a strobe against Melissa on more than 8 separate occasions, despite being well aware of her epilepsy. When Melissa told him about her disability, he told her, "Well then, go away," and continued using the strobe against her. Defendants discriminating against people with psychiatric disabilities and service animals. The PPB has a well-documented history of brutality and discrimination against people with psychiatric disabilities. In 2012, the United States Department of Justice found that PPB engages in a pattern or practice of unnecessary or unreasonable force during interactions with people who have or are perceived to have psychiatric disabilities. The DOJ found a pattern of dangerous uses of force against persons who posed little or no threat and who could not, as a result of their psychiatric disabilities, comply with officers' command, including practices that escalate the use of force where there were clear earlier junctures where the force could have been avoided or minimized. These practices, the DOJ concluded, resulted from deficiencies in policy, training, and supervision. As recently as early 2020, then Police Jamie Resch acknowledged that the DOJ's consent decree would not stop police from shooting suspects with psychiatric disabilities. In 2019, fatal police shootings of suspects with mental health disabilities actually increased. Indeed, as City Commissioner Joanne Hardesty remarked, "We're killing more people today with mental health issues by the Portland Police than we did before the DOJ came to town." That consent decree was supposed to be us getting our act together as a city, and instead we're getting worse. Juniper is a person with psychiatric disability, complex PTSD. The symptoms of PTSD differ between individuals. For Juniper, it manifests as obsessive-compulsive tendencies, hypervigilance, panic attacks, and dissociative episodes. Being in crowds or otherwise surrounded by people often exacerbates these symptoms, as does being touched or startled by strangers. As a result, it is nearly impossible for Juniper to go out in public or interact with others for any significant length in time. Despite this, Juniper protests to express their political beliefs. In order to manage and mitigate their symptoms, Juniper relies on Wallace, a trained service dog. Juniper and Wallace have been working together since 2016. Wallace has been trained as a service animal by Casey Fletcher of Compass Key Service Dog Training. Casey continues to train Wallace as needed. Wallace wears a yellow service dog vest when out with Juniper. Wallace performs a variety of tasks to assist with Juniper's disability, including but not limited to accompanying Juniper in public, being vigilant of Juniper's surroundings, and alert barking, which in this case is barking to notify Juniper that someone is approaching them, as well as providing physical contact with Juniper when they experience a heightened emotional response. As part of his training, and to further mitigate Juniper's anxiety, Wallace is taught to be unflappable and minimally responsive to outside stimuli. Wallace is also trained to not escalate confrontation or physically defend Juniper. Because of Wallace's presence, Juniper has been able to attend protests in downtown Portland several nights a week since June. Because of the defendant's pervasive use of chemical agents at protests, Juniper must engage in substantial planning to protect themselves and Wallace, including bringing their car and buying plastic drop cloths to scoop up Wallace in case of chemical exposure. On July 7th, Juniper was attending a protest with Wallace when federal officers began swarming protesters, throwing flashbangs and firing tear gas. One flashbang exploded about 20 feet from Wallace and startled him. Since then, Wallace has become hyper-aware and is easily startled by loud noises. He also refuses to walk through any kind of smoke, including wafting barbecue smoke. On July 9th, 2020, Juniper was on the sidewalk at Southwest 2nd and Jefferson behind the Wyatt Building in downtown Portland, marking the property line with surveyor's chalk. And this was something that they went into a lot of research to find exactly where the property line was. because protesters were being told by DHS that if they stepped onto federal property, they were going to be arrested, and that federal property included the sidewalk and, a portion of the street. So Juniper did the research and figured out exactly where the agreement between the city and the federal government said what was their property. So, although the Wyatt building is federal property, most of the sidewalk is city property. Juniper was marking the line to prevent fellow protesters from inadvertently trespassing and risking arrest by federal officers, like I was saying. Federal officers approached it from the Wyatt building and surrounded Juniper. Juniper was concerned the officers would arrest them. Juniper stated that they had PTSD, that Wallace was their service dog, and that officers should not unexpectedly surround them in that manner. The officers withdrew without taking further action. The next night, on July 10th, Juniper and Wallace went back to the Wyatt building to mark the property line again. Juniper tethered Wallace to a large water bottle. This is a standard practice for them. Since this, I have worked with Juniper on some research that they were doing on the water system, and yeah, I can say this is how Juniper and Wallace work together. Without any prior warning, federal officers emerged from the Wyatt building. They attempted to grab Juniper and triggered an immediate panic response. Juniper dove towards Wallace, who was standing still and alert barking. More officers arrived, surrounded Juniper, and tackled them to the ground. These were the same officers who had surrounded Juniper the night before and learned that doing so exacerbates Juniper's PTSD. The officers' behavior triggered a dissociative panic attack. Juniper's body locked up and they started screaming in anticipation of the brutal assault that they believed was coming. During such panic attacks, physical touch with Wallace is incredibly important for Juniper, as Wallace's presence helps emotionally ground them. Juniper was also worried the officers would see Wallace as a threat and hurt him, so they reached for Wallace to protect him. Juniper put their arms around Wallace, but the officers grabbed Wallace and pulled him out of Juniper's grasp. The officers squeezed Wallace so hard that he defecated, then yanked him away by his collar. After removing Wallace, the officers sprayed Juniper with pepper spray at point-blank range and placed them in metal handcuffs. Within minutes, Juniper's left pinky began to go numb. Juniper notified the agents, but they did not loosen the handcuffs. 6 officers lifted Juniper, whose entire body was now rigid, and carried them into the Wyatt building, while approximately 9 other officers formed a perimeter around them. In total, 15 officers, all fully armed, surrounded Juniper before dragging them from city property into the Wyatt building. Juniper was covered with mace and having a dissociative panic attack. Normally, this is when Wallace could ease Juniper's anxiety through physical contact. Instead, the officers needlessly separated Juniper and Wallace for the next 9 hours. Juniper told the officers that they were a woman and that their pronouns were they and them. But throughout the night, federal officers repeatedly misgendered Juniper, suggesting that the officers would only treat Juniper as a woman if they looked like it, and refusing Juniper's request to be searched by a female officer, stating, "We don't do that here." DHS officers looked through Juniper's money clip and removed their U.S. passport ID card, which indicated Juniper is legally female. Regardless, the officers continued to misgender Juniper throughout their detainment. Given that Juniper's PTSD is rooted in years of gender dysphoria and transphobic assaults, this persistent denial of their gender identity only served to worsen Juniper's mental health crisis. As an aside, as someone who is transgender myself, that is an area that, on a federal level, we don't have the protections that we have in Oregon State. On the state level, we just recently gained the ability for people to choose an X gender on their ID, and in court records. But federally, they still are stuck on a male-female binary, and depending on what state you're born in, some states will not let you change that on a birth certificate, either as a modification or as a new birth certificate. And whatever you were assigned at birth, you're stuck with. And that can end up being what all your stuff is stuck with. I got lucky in my case that I was able to get everything fixed, but that was just because of where I happened to be born. The officers seated Juniper on the floor in the foyer of the Wyatt building with pepper spray covering their face and clothes. A burning sensation had spread through Juniper's face, lungs, nose, and mouth, and their heart rate was continually elevated as a result of both the mace and the continuing panic attack. The officers refused to call medical personnel to flush Juniper's eyes or nose, leaving them the choice of continuing to burn or having untrained officers attempt to do so. Juniper again told the officers that they had a disability and were in crisis. The officers told them to buck up and to relax and breathe. Juniper again notified the officers that their hands were going numb, but the officers did not adjust the metal handcuffs. Officers attempted to question Juniper about their activities that evening. Juniper repeatedly requested a lawyer and medical attention. Neither were provided. Juniper recognized the badge number of the officer questioning them and knew the officer had been present the night before when they disclosed their PTSD. Eventually, the officers carried Juniper to the basement garage of the Wyatt building, Mirandized them, and told them they were being arrested for spray painting federal property. Again, they were questioned before being Mirandized. They were using surveyor chalk, which, by my understanding, is not spray paint. And they were on city property at the time that they were arrested. After about half an hour in the garage, Portland Fire and Rescue arrived and attempted unsuccessfully to flush out Juniper's eyes and nose. And this was, after being in there for who knows how long. This actually exacerbated Juniper's conditions and made them feel as though they were drowning. Fire and Rescue refused to remove Juniper's contacts. Throughout their 2-hour detention at the Wyatt building, the officers refused to remove Juniper from handcuffs or reposition them, even though they repeatedly insisted the cuffs were unnecessarily tight and that their hands were going numb. Much of the time, Juniper was lying on their side with their hands cuffed behind their back. After the Wyatt building, the officers used an unmarked SUV to transfer Juniper and Wallace to the custody of the U.S. Marshals at the federal courthouse. Before, during, and after transport, the officers put a spit hood on Juniper's head. The hood trapped pepper spray on Juniper's face, close to their nose and mouth, causing them to gag and vomit slightly. Juniper could hear Wallace in the back of the car, but they only made brief physical contact. At the courthouse, the marshals took Juniper out of wrist cuffs and placed them in a holding cell for 6 hours in leg cuffs. They took Wallace to the courthouse garage and tethered him to a truck. Throughout Juniper's detention for 6 hours, Wallace did not receive food, water, or any opportunity to relieve himself. Juniper's cell had no potable water, soap, or hand sanitizer. While Juniper was in the holding cell, their mental state continued to deteriorate. They began to dissociate, talking to themselves, scratching themselves, and tapping their head against the wall. They experienced minor convulsions down the left side of their body. At one point, a marshal came and asked Juniper if they were okay. Juniper said no. The marshal told Juniper their dog was still in the garage and walked away. It is difficult to know exactly when precisely in detention this was, as Juniper's mental health crisis had warped their sense of linear time. Juniper told the marshals or officers that they needed to take medication at regular times throughout the day and that the medication was with their personal effects. The marshals or officers withheld Juniper's medication. DHS officials came and informed Juniper that they were being charged with refusing to comply, resisting arrest, and assaulting an officer. They also told Juniper that they would be transferred to Multnomah County Jail, a facility that would not accept Wallace. The officials told Juniper that if no one came to pick up Wallace, Wallace would go to a shelter, that he won't be there when you get out. Juniper understood this as a threat to euthanize Wallace while Juniper was detained. Juniper reiterated their request for a lawyer and said they did not consent to Wallace's removal from them. After several hours, during which Juniper made multiple requests for a service animal and a lawyer, DHS officials told Juniper they were going to cut them a break. The officials said they would release Juniper with a citation and a future court date because the county jail could not be made accessible for them. The officials returned most of Juniper's possessions and unceremoniously released them and Wallace outside the courthouse in the middle of the night. Notably missing from the possessions returned to Juniper was their 2019 Women's Flat Track Derby Association World Championship medal, which they were wearing when detained. The medal has not yet been returned to Juniper. Since July 10, 2020, Juniper has struggled with neuropathy in their hands after spending hours in handcuffs. This makes it extremely difficult for them to perform their job duties, most of which involve using a computer. Juniper has experienced heightened hypervigilance, especially about police cars, trucks, and cars with tinted windows. Juniper has experienced bouts of depression and mania, cycling between periods of complete inaction and insomnia-fueled overwork. In general, Juniper's social anxiety and agoraphobia are also heightened. This makes it challenging for Juniper to engage in ordinary interactions like necessary shopping trips. Juniper's social interaction has decreased and their withdrawal has increased. Service dogs like Wallace rely on a strong bond with their owner to be effective. Prolonged separation from their owner, especially in a high-stress situation, can have a negative impact on a service dog's psychology and efficacy. Since being separated, Wallace has shown symptoms of elevated attachment, including not staying outside to go to the bathroom by himself, but requiring Juniper to accompany him. Since July 10, 2020, Wallace has suffered a marked regression in his training and behavior. Wallace has returned to Casey for supplemental training, and Juniper has resorted to using rewards to incentivize behaviors that had been deeply ingrained for years. Wallace is now concerned for his own safety as well as Juniper's. That is unusual and, for a psychiatric service dog, counterproductive. Wallace's regression has made it much more difficult for Juniper to attend protests as they once did. Wallace will not leave Juniper's car in downtown Portland. Since Juniper cannot go far from Wallace without adverse health consequences for both of them, they are essentially tethered to the car. Juniper's participation in protests has predominantly been limited to support work at off-site locations. And I will say, I have actually seen this myself. Like I said before, I worked with Juniper a few times as they were doing some research and I was out helping with documentation. And whenever Wallace couldn't see Juniper, you could tell he was nervous and needed regular reassurance, and that sounds like that's not what's supposed to be in his circumstances. Defendants' incessant use of tear gas, flashbang grenades, and other munitions pose a significant continued threat to both Wallace and Juniper's well-being by exacerbating Juniper's PTSD and preventing Wallace from effectively mitigating Juniper's symptoms. The presence of heavily armed police officers, and particularly those who wear riot gear and camouflage and appear without warning, puts Juniper and Wallace into states of hypervigilance that prevent normal social functioning and create physical symptoms. On multiple occasions during protests and at other times of the day, merely arriving downtown triggers anxiety attacks in Juniper that manifest an elevated heart rate, sweating, convulsions like those experienced while in custody, and hyperventilation. Use of chemical weapons without proper cleanup have also rendered the ground and air physically unsafe for Wallace and other service animals, as many of the weapons are especially toxic to dogs. Defendants' use of tear gas and other chemical agents threatens the lives of people with disabilities. Defendants' use of chemical agents, including those in tear gas, smoke grenades, mace, and pepper balls, pose an extraordinary risk to the health and safety of people with disabilities. People with disabilities that involve respiratory functions or inflammatory conditions such as endometriosis are at significant risk of exacerbated symptoms, long-term damage, and even death. Chemical agents like tear gas are so noxious that they were banned in war under the 1928 Geneva Protocol. The CDC's own website labels these agents as poison, referring to exposure as poisoning for which no antidote exists. Yet, as detailed above, defendants have regularly employed these agents against those who attend protests in Portland, and they have saturated the city with toxic chemicals. Exposure to substances like tear gas immediately causes the following symptoms: excessive tearing, burning, blurred vision, reddened eyes, runny nose, burning and nasal swelling, burning and irritated mouth, difficulty swallowing and drooling, chest tightness, coughing, a choking sensation, wheezing, shortness of breath, skin burns and rashes, and nausea and vomiting. Significant exposure can cause blindness, glaucoma, and cataracts, as well as severe chemical burns to the throat and lungs and respiratory failure, which can result in death. Tear gas and other inhaled chemicals are especially harmful for people with asthma, emphysema, bronchitis, and other respiratory illnesses. The chemicals significantly exacerbate these conditions, triggering asthma attacks and other forms of severe respiratory distress, as well as long-term damage. Some activists in Portland have reported to DRO and plaintiffs' counsel that tear gas and other chemicals significantly aggravate their inflammatory conditions like endometriosis and fibromyalgia, causing intense and more frequent pain. The effect on people with endometriosis, a painful inflammatory condition in which uterine tissue grows outside the uterus, is particularly marked. Tear gas has been linked with increased bleeding, severe cramping, more frequent and disrupted menstruation cycles, and even miscarriages in people whose uteruses are otherwise healthy. The impact on those with endometriosis is even more severe given the extreme pain that accompanies menstruation. Defendants use tear gas and other chemicals indiscriminately and voluminously in Portland, blanketing a wide swath of the city, sometimes dozens of times each night. The chemicals do not simply blow away in the wind. They leave behind a residue that lingers for weeks and can cause deleterious health effects long after. People represented by DRO have reported that their asthma is triggered simply walking into a park or other areas of the city the day after tear gas has been used. When dispersed in aerosolized form, tear gas and other chemicals do not isolate themselves to the immediate vicinity in which they are used. They adhere to surfaces almost 1,000 feet away. They have permeated people's homes, the downtown county jail, and even the federal courthouse, hampering the court's operation. We are now in the midst of the horrifying COVID-19 panic, which is spread through respiratory droplets and which has already caused the death of over 200,000 people. But tear gas and other chemical agents cause coughing and choking, which create respiratory droplets and contribute to the spread of COVID-19. For this reason, the use of chemical agents is particularly concerning for people with compromised immune systems who are at a heightened risk of severe complications from COVID-19. For these reasons, 1,288 public health professionals signed an open letter opposing any use of tear gas, smoke, or other respiratory irritants, which could increase risk for COVID-19 by making the respiratory tract more susceptible to infection, exacerbating existing inflammation, and inducing coughing. Defendants are well aware of the need for reasonable modification and effective communication, but refuse to act. It is obvious that people with disabilities require reasonable modifications and effective communication as protests. Defendants have an affirmative obligation to make their programs and services accessible, including programs and services related to law enforcement. Failing to provide accessible services related to law enforcement protests effectively denies equal access to the right of protest and creates immeasurable dangers for people with disabilities. Defendants should provide reasonable modifications and effective communication to protesters with disabilities as a matter of course. The Portland Police has enacted policies to allow protesters without disabilities to avoid harm by police officers. For example, Police Directive 0635.10, entitled Crowd Management and Crowd Control, provides that when feasible, police should make loud, intelligible, and consistent announcements and warnings to the crowd to allow the crowd time to comply with orders given from police members. Before taking action to disperse a crowd, the police should order the crowd to disperse and should only use riot control agents, such as tear gas, when avenues of escape, i.e. a clear path or route, are available to the crowd. Police can detain protesters after providing a lawful order to disperse, followed by a reasonable opportunity to comply with that order. Upon information of belief, Portland Police has not enacted any similar policies to provide protesters with disabilities an equal opportunity to avoid harm by police officers. Upon information of belief, there are no directives requiring sign language interpreters to communicate dispersal warnings or other orders, providing people with mobility disabilities an accessible route to escape tear gas, or otherwise providing modifications to ensure that people with disabilities have reasonable opportunity to comply with dispersal orders. Before filing suit, plaintiffs and others have repeatedly notified defendants that they have an obligation to provide modifications and make law enforcement actions at protests accessible to people with disabilities. I'm one of the ones that contacted the city and the Portland Police. Defendants have been notified of the need for modifications by numerous people on a variety of social media platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, through messages and posts directed at or tagging the agencies or their officials. In my case, I sent emails to relevant people. In response, defendants have done nothing. On July 23, 2020, Phillip informed Mayor Wheeler directly of the need for modifications for persons with disabilities, including people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Earlier in the day, Phillip asked Wheeler on Twitter whether he would be providing any accommodations. After receiving no response, Phillip addressed Wheeler at the protest and informed him directly of the need for modifications. This appears to be the one time that Wheeler showed up at a protest, got gassed by DHS, and then left immediately afterwards. In response, Wheeler indicated that an ASL interpreter had accompanied him that evening. Unbeknownst to Wheeler, however, Phillip had arranged for and hired the interpreter. When Phillip informed Wheeler of this fact, Wheeler could only move on to the next protester's question in embarrassment. Phillip and the interpreter then left. That's bold. Wheeler tried to take credit for an interpreter being there when he had nothing to do with it. Similarly, Melissa emailed Wheeler and the city's ADA coordinator directly and notified numerous law enforcement officers and agents about the impact that strobe lights have on her epilepsy. Neither Wheeler nor the ADA coordinator responded. On the other hand, multiple officers told her that if she was so affected, she should not be protesting. In fact, Officer 1004013, a Doe defendant, has repeatedly gone out of his way to strobe Melissa after being notified of her epilepsy. Officers have told other protesters with disabilities that they should not be out protesting. After officers shoved the protesters and told them to move faster, the protesters told officers of their mobility-related disabilities. The officers, faced with these pleas, told the protesters that they did not belong and continued to shove and scream at them. In addition to the efforts of individual plaintiffs and other community members, DRO sent letters detailing the need for accommodations to Chief Lavelle, Mayor Ted Wheeler, the city's ADA coordinator, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Oregon, and Acting Secretary Wolf in late July and early August of 2020. DRO sent a similar letter to Superintendent Hampton and Sheriff Reese in early September. DRO's letters explained the issues that impact people who use service dogs, are deaf or hard of hearing, are blind or low vision, have asthma, mobility-based disabilities, and epilepsy, and who have inflammatory conditions. The letters explicitly requested reasonable accommodations and modifications of tactics on behalf of protesters with disabilities. To date, only Portland Police and the city have responded to these letters. So the county, the sheriff's office, the state district attorney, and Chad Wolf's office didn't even respond to a federally mandated agency. On September 17, 2020, DRO and the Plaintiffs' Council met with Portland Police and the city to discuss the ongoing issues regarding the lack of reasonable modifications for protesters with disabilities and continuing violence at the hands of Portland Police. During these decisions, Portland Police and the city acknowledged that they do not have any policies governing police interactions with protesters with disabilities. On October 8th, so like 3 weeks later, via email communication, the city stated that it could not provide ASL interpreters on-site at demonstrations to communicate Portland Police instructions to deaf and hard of hearing protesters. Essentially, they gave up. On October 14th, 2020, another week later, DRO and Plaintiffs' Council met for a second time with Portland Police and the city to discuss their concerns. Portland Police and the city would not provide any concrete steps, plans, or timelines to ensure that protesters with disabilities are afforded their constitutional rights and to prevent undue force and discrimination against them. Indeed, Portland Police made clear that any potential steps that they could take would be subject to a lengthy bureaucratic approval process that could take weeks or even months. Sounds to me like it's too hard, so we're not even going to try. Acting Director Wolf has repeatedly and publicly justified the actions of DHS agents while ignoring plaintiffs' requests for modifications. Rather than showing any inclination to provide reasonable modifications to or respect the constitutional right of people with disabilities, the prevailing sentiment from defendants has been that protesting is only for people who do not have disabilities. The Portland Police, DHS, U.S. Marshals, State Police, and Multnomah County Sheriff's Office have all responded with force to various protests in the city of Portland since May 2020. Defendants have also collaborated and worked jointly in devising responses to specific protests. For example, in September 2020, federal authorities deputized dozens of members of both Portland Police and county sheriffs to serve as federal deputies in responding to these protests. 50 state police troopers were federally deputized in August 2020 for the purpose of allowing joint operations between OSP and federal authorities. Oregon Governor Kate Brown has on some occasions created a unified command, allowing joint command and control for state police and county sheriffs in response to protests. Protesters have witnessed obviously coordinated action between federal and local authorities in responding to the protests. Each defendant has coordinated its response to the protests with other agencies. Each defendant has individually and jointly failed to provide reasonable modifications to protesters with disabilities. None of the agencies communicate reasonably accessible notice to protesters who are deaf or hard of hearing before using force or making arrests. None of the agencies appropriately restrict the use of tear gas, bull rush charges, strobes, or other force against protesters with disabilities. After DRO submitted requests for modifications to the agencies, none of the agency's adopted reasonable modifications that would adequately provide equal access to protesters with disabilities. Plaintiffs have made every effort to resolve these issues short of litigation. Unfortunately, defendants' refusal to act have forced plaintiffs to file this lawsuit to vindicate their fundamental constitutional rights and the rights guaranteed to them by the ADA and Rehabilitation Act. From here, a lot of the rest of it gets drier. This is where they'll say the specific laws that were violated and how and such. So we have the first claim for relief, which is a violation of Title II of the ADA against the city, county, Ted Wheeler, Chuck Lavelle, Sheriff Reese, and Travis Hampton, all in their official capacities. The ADA and its implementing regulations provide that no qualified individual with a disability shall, by reason of such disability, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of the services, programs, or activities of a public entity or be subjected to discrimination by any such entity. Title II's requirements extend to anything a public entity does, including arrests and other law enforcement interactions. Despite these requirements, defendants violate the ADA and its implementing regulations in multiple ways. Defendants have an affirmative obligation to make benefits, services, and programs accessible to people with disabilities. The general regulatory obligation to modify policies, practices, or procedures requires law enforcement to make changes in policies that result in discriminatory arrests or abuse of individuals with disabilities. And this even goes back to in the beginning when we talked about people in mental health crisis that have been killed by the police. Defendants, however, have failed to make reasonable modifications that will make law enforcement's actions equally accessible to people with disabilities. Indeed, their response to protests actively deny people with disabilities their rights at protests. The obligation to provide reasonable modifications requires covered entities to provide effective communication to people with communication disabilities. Defendants fail to provide reasonable modifications, including effective communication for people with disabilities at protests. For Philip and others who are deaf or hard of hearing, for example, defendants have failed to make appropriate steps to ensure that communications with participants, members of the public, and companions with disabilities are as effective as communications with others. To that end, defendants are required to furnish appropriate auxiliary aids and services where necessary to afford individuals with disabilities an equal opportunity to participate in and enjoy the benefits of a service, program, or activity of a public entity. Defendants make no efforts whatsoever to communicate with protesters who are deaf or hard of hearing, including when they declare unlawful assemblies and riots and issue orders to disperse. Again, the police policy for crowd control tries to say that if they're able to make an announcement over social media, which then requires that anyone with a disability happens to have a device capable of receiving that social media, possibly having an account and actively watching. Basically putting the burden on the person with a disability, which it goes the other way around. Defendants make... Okay, yeah. Defendants make no efforts whatsoever to communicate with protesters who are deaf or hard of hearing, including when they declare unlawful assemblies and riots and issue orders to disperse. In the same way, defendants discriminate against plaintiffs by communicating about their activities at protests only to protesters who are hearing persons. Defendants' use of bull rushes and other forms of force violate the rights of people with a variety of disabilities, including those with mobility disabilities and those who are blind or low vision. Unlike people with disabilities, plaintiffs are unable to disperse quickly or respond in the same way to other police commands, putting them at significant risk of violence by defendants. Use of force by defendants also has a disproportionate effect on people with disabilities, many of whom heal more slowly and are more susceptible to long-term damage. Defendants' use of strobe lights induces seizures in Melissa and others with epilepsy. The use of strobes, however, serves no purpose that is not equally served by other forms of lighting other than to disorient protesters and stymie efforts to identify officers. And this is one that I've dealt with myself. I haven't had as much of the strobe lights, but I have had when I'm trying to film police. When they know that I'm looking at them, they'll shine a flashlight in my camera. And I've had a time where the only way I was able to get a picture was a quick shot before he could raise his flashlight up. Defendants' use of flashbang grenades, tear gas, and other riot control agents, and their separation of people from their service animals denies people who use service animals the equal opportunity to participate in protests by restricting their ability to attend protests with their animals. Defendants' use of tear gas, pepper balls, and other chemical irritants poses a significant risk of harm or death for people with respiratory and inflammatory conditions. The lack of clear egress routes for dispersal and barriers to egress erected by defendants violates the rights of people with disabilities who are forced to risk stampedes and trampling from other protesters, law enforcement force, and other grievous harm. The lack of clear and consistent directions likewise puts plaintiffs, including those who are blind and low vision, at significant risk of harm, arrest, and violence. Remember, when cops will come in a case like this and arrest people, they tend to not go for people who might be causing problems. They will grab whoever they can grab quickest, and that is more likely to be a disabled person who can't get out of the way. Defendants subject plaintiffs to use of force and arrest because they mistake plaintiffs' inaction, delayed action, or slowed actions in response to orders to disperse and other commands as a refusal to comply. Further, defendants' crowd management directives and other measures constitute programs and/or activities under the ADA. By failing to establish crowd management measures that permit protesters with disabilities an opportunity to avoid harm by police, defendants have denied these people with disabilities meaningful access to their crowd management program and activity. Reasonable modifications and effective communication measures are readily available. For communications with deaf or hard of hearing persons, or protesters, for example, ASL interpreters and visual messaging systems of the sort already used on the roadside to communicate closed exits could be effectively employed to notify protesters who are deaf or hard of hearing when an unlawful assembly is declared. Reasonable modification might also include ceasing the use of certain less lethal weapons and tactics entirely, using them only in circumstances designed to minimize risk to protesters with disability, or providing substantial verbal and visual warning before using the less lethal weapons and tactics. Likewise, defendants can identify and inform protesters of accessible avenues of egress before using force or other tactics that may harm people with mobility disabilities. Nor would the requested modifications require a fundamental alteration of defendants' programs and services. For example, defendants are already constitutionally required to provide adequate notice and an opportunity to comply before dispersing crowds. Portland's own policies already require the same, yet they have made no attempt to provide adequate and timely notice to people who are deaf or hard of hearing, denying them the benefits of these policies. As set forth above, defendants have failed to satisfy their affirmative obligation to provide reasonable accommodations and auxiliary aids and services that provide equal access with or without a specific request from a person with a disability. Defendants have also failed to respond to requests for modification and auxiliary aids and services by individual plaintiffs and others. Defendants' failure to provide reasonable modifications and auxiliary aids and services was and continues to be with deliberate indifference and reckless disregard to the rights of people with disabilities. Pursuant to 42 U.S.C. 12133, plaintiffs are entitled to declaratory and injunctive relief as well as damages and reasonable attorney's fees and costs. Second claim for relief against the Rehabilitation Act. This is against the city, county, mayor, police chief, sheriff, Travis Hampton, Chad Wolf, and Donald Washington, all in their official capacities. Plaintiffs reallege and incorporate by reference each of the allegations up above. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and its implementing regulations provide that no otherwise qualified individual with a disability shall, solely by reason of his or her disability, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Despite these requirements, defendants violate Section 504 in multiple ways. A program or activity means all of the operations of a department, agency, special purpose district, or other instrumentality of a state or local government, or the entity of such state or local government that distributes such assistance, and each such department or agency, and each other state or local government entity to which the assistance is extended, in the case of assistance to a state or local government. Section 504 regulations prohibit discrimination by a recipient of federal funds by denying a qualified person with a disability the opportunity to participate in or benefit from the aid, benefit, or service. Section 504 regulations prohibit discrimination by a recipient of federal funds by affording a qualified person with a disability an opportunity to participate in and benefit from the aid, benefit, or service that is not equal to the afforded others. Section 504 regulations prohibit discrimination by a recipient by affording a qualified person with a disability an opportunity to participate in and benefit from the aid, benefit, service that is not as effective as that provided others. Very similar difference, or very similar wording, just one is not equal and the other is not as effective. Section 504 regulations prohibit discrimination by a recipient of federal funds by providing significant assistance to an agency, organization, or person that discriminates on the basis of disability and providing any aid, benefit, or service to beneficiaries of the recipient's programs or activity. Section 504 regulations prohibit discrimination by a recipient of federal funds by utilizing criteria or methods of administration that have the effect of subjecting qualified persons with disabilities to discrimination on the basis of disability. Section 504 regulations require that recipients of federal financial assistance shall take appropriate steps to ensure that communication with their beneficiaries are available to persons with impaired vision and hearing. Plaintiffs are otherwise qualified to participate in the services, programs, or activities that are provided to individuals by defendants. All of these defendants receive financial assistance. And through the acts and omissions described above, defendants and their agents and employees have and continue to violate the Rehabilitation Act and the regulations promulgated thereunder by excluding plaintiffs from participating in, denying plaintiffs the benefits of, and subjecting plaintiffs based solely on by reason of their disability to discrimination in defendant services and activities in managing and regulating protests in Portland. Yes, this is very long. And again, defendants make no efforts whatsoever to communicate with protesters who are deaf or hard of hearing, including when they declare unlawful assemblies and riots and issue orders to disperse. In the same way, defendants discriminate against plaintiffs by communicating about their activities and protests only to protesters who are hearing persons. Defendants' use of bull rushes and other forms of force violate the rights of people with a variety of disabilities, including those with mobility disabilities and those who are blind or low vision. Unlike people without disabilities, plaintiffs are unable to disperse quickly or respond in the same way to other police commands, putting them at significant risk of violence from defendants. Use of force by defendants also has a disproportionate effect on people with disabilities, many of whom heal more slowly and are more susceptible to long-term damage. Defendants' use of strobe lights induces seizure in Melissa and others with epilepsy. The use of strobes, however, serves no purpose that is not equally served by other forms of lighting other than to disorient protesters and stymie efforts to identify officers. Their use of flashbangs, tear gas, and other riot control agents, and their separation of people from their service animals denies people who use service animals the equal opportunity to participate by restricting their ability to attend with their animals. Defendants' use of tear gas, pepper balls, and chemical irritants poses a significant risk of harm or death for people with respiratory and inflammatory conditions. The lack of clear egress routes for dispersal and barriers to egress erected by defendants violate the right of people with disabilities who are forced to risk stampedes and trampling from other protesters, law enforcement force, and other grievous harm. The lack of clear and consistent directions likewise puts plaintiffs, including those who are blind and low vision, at significant risk of harm, arrest, and violence. The defendants subject plaintiffs to use of force and arrest because they mistake plaintiffs' inaction, delayed action, or slowed action in response to orders to disperse and other commands as a refusal to comply. Further, defendants' crowd management directives and other measures constitute programs and/or services. By failing to establish crowd management measures that permit protesters with disabilities an opportunity to avoid police harm, defendants have denied those people with disabilities meaningful access to their crowd management program activity. Reasonable modification of effective communication measures are readily available, and basically, I'm realizing that this is rehashing a lot of what happened with the ADA claims. Defendants identifying and informing protesters of accessible avenues of egress. Being able to use the same roadside signs that we use on the freeway for exit closures. Again, defendants have failed to satisfy their affirmative obligation. And I really don't know how the city is going to try to justify these failings, because this seems very cut and dry and pretty horrible. Like they say, with deliberate indifference and reckless disregard for the rights of people with disabilities. In this case, these looks like no Section 504 damages are being sought against federal agencies, which I'm not fully sure what that means. I think that's just talking about financial stuff. Third claim for relief, the violation of plaintiffs' free speech rights under the First and 14th Amendments. People with disabilities have participated as attendees, medics, and journalists in protests against police violence, racism, and against other forms of discrimination since the protests began on May 28th. They do constitute constitutionally protected speech and/or conduct. The First Amendment of the Constitution protects plaintiffs' right to engage in their protest-related activities free of federal government suppression or retaliation. First and 14th Amendments to the Constitution protect plaintiffs' right to engage in their protest-related activities free from state and local government suppression or retaliation. As described in this complaint, defendants failed to provide reasonable modification to law enforcement practices at protests to ensure equal access by and equal treatment of plaintiffs as people with disabilities during protest-related activity. Defendants, for example, regularly fail to communicate orders to disperse from protest-related activity in a manner that people with disabilities can readily understand, and regularly fail to provide sufficient time or means for people with disabilities to comply with orders to disperse from protest-related activity. Furthermore, defendants treat plaintiffs less favorably than others because they are people with disabilities who dare to engage in protest-related activity and request reasonable modifications. And they routinely use excessive force against people with and without disabilities, including plaintiffs, who engage in protest-related activity, thus creating a frightening and dangerous war zone environment that presents heightened danger for people with disabilities. In other words, even if people with disabilities aren't directly impacted by the police, which has been me for a lot of my on-the-ground coverage, just being there is dangerous for me. Defendants' actions would deter a reasonable person of ordinary firmness from participating in protest-related activity. I shouldn't have to say, this is dangerous for me, but I'm still going to do it. Defendants' actions have in fact deterred participation in protest-related activity by plaintiffs and others. I'm one of them that a number of times I've had to take a step back, and figure out how to protect myself from the police. For me, it's never been protecting myself from protesters. It's always protecting myself from the police. While some people with disabilities continue to regularly engage in protest-related activity, others have stopped going, and others have been too fearful to engage at all because of police violence. Defendants' actions are at least substantially in retaliation for plaintiffs' constitutionally protected participation in protest-related activity, including for their involvement in protests challenging law enforcement violence, discrimination, and other misconduct, and for their requests of reasonable modification. Remember, we're talking about where Melissa has said numerous times, I have epilepsy, please stop shining that strobe light in my face. And then that one officer targets her 8 times. Defendants' actions have chilled plaintiffs' exercise their First and 14th Amendment rights to engage in protest-related activity. They also violate First and 14th Amendments because they suppress constitutionally protected protest-related activity but are not narrowly tailored to any compelling government interest, which is the standard that courts use to determine when it is okay to abridge a constitutional right. There has to be a compelling government interest. And you tailor it to how narrowly you can do that while still providing for the issue that the government needs to take care of. Defendants do not enhance plaintiffs' compliance with dispersal orders or promote public safety when they fail to provide reasonable modifications that would allow plaintiffs to understand and comply. Instead, they only increase confusion and disorder when plaintiffs are unable to comply. Defendants' use of excessive force against people who are protesting police brutality only fuels public anger, intensifies the need for protests, and makes the public less safe. And defendants' disparate treatment of people with disabilities who engage in protests does not even have a lawful and rational basis. Federal courts have inherent authority to grant injunctive relief to direct compliance of the federal government and individual federal officers with the First Amendment. And then we go into, looks like a number of individual counts of the violations of the First and 14th Amendment. The first one is against the city, Ted Wheeler, Chief Lavelle, the county, Sheriff Reese, and the individual local officers, as a Monell claim, which is, I have to go and look up the specifics to it, because Monell claims don't come up very often because they're hard to prove. But it's basically a city being liable for instead of, oh, we made a mistake in not following the law, this is a case of we have institutionalized not following the law. Such as, in this case, they're probably going to talk about the lack of policy and the refusal to create a policy. The local defendants have a policy, practice, and custom of the First and 14th Amendment violations described in this complaint. The policy, practice, and custom is so widespread that officials at all levels of the local defendant agencies, including the individual local defendants, were aware of and deliberately indifferent to the violations and or ratified the violations and or actively participated in the violations and or ordered others to participate in the violations. Plaintiffs and others repeatedly provided the local defendants direct notice of the First and 14th Amendment violations and the harm they were causing. Because of this notice, and because of the widespread nature of the violations and the obviousness of the resulting harm, local defendant officials at all levels, including the individual local defendants, knew or should have known of the need to train and supervise those under their control to prevent the violations, but they repeatedly failed to provide such training and supervision. Remember, people involved in this case have been dealing with this since the lawsuit in 2012. Without altering the burden of proof on any claim or defense, plaintiffs alleged the actions of the individual local defendants were objectively unreasonable in light of clearly established law. Count 2 is Travis Hampton, which is Oregon State Police. They directed or participated in the violations of the First Amendment rights as described, and they were objectively unreasonable in light of clearly established law. The third count is against Chad Wolf, Donald Washington, and federal defendants. So the first count was the local violation, second count was the state, and the third one is the federal. Federal defendants willfully participated and conspired with state and local defendants in the violations of the plaintiff's First Amendment rights as described. Count 4 is a Bivens claim, which is, from my memory, it is when somebody has been unlawfully detained, basically arrested, but then not charged. And this one is against Chad Wolf, Donald Washington, and federal defendants, so this is another federal charge. Plaintiff's claim against the individual federal defendants arise under the Bivens v. 6 Unknown Named Agents of Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which is commonly known as a Bivens claim. The individual federal defendants, acting under color of federal authority, meaning they were acting like they were doing lawful orders, but they weren't, actively participated in the First Amendment violations described in this complaint and or were aware of and deliberately indifferent to the violations and or ratified the violations, actively participated and or ordered others to participate in the violations. The violations are so widespread and the resultant harm so obvious that the individual federal defendants who supervise others, including defendants Wolf and Washington, knew or should have known of the need to train and supervise those under their control to prevent the violations, but they repeatedly failed to provide such training or supervision. Without altering the burden of proof On any claim or defense, plaintiffs allege that the actions of the individual federal defendants were objectively unreasonable in light of clearly established law. And remember also, we have found that federal agents that were sent out here, a number of them weren't even properly trained for crowd control. Should not have been out here in a law enforcement type position from the federal government. And there are suits coming out of other federal courts that are confirming that Chad Wolf was not even constitutionally able to, or legally able to, do the actions that he's been doing because of how he was appointed to his position. So those are going to be other issues that will probably come up in the actual court cases. I have the fourth claim for relief. Violation of plaintiff's right to be free from unlawful seizure and excessive force under the 4th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. Remember the basically the 14th Amendment, I believe that one is the one that federal constitutional rights also apply to the states. Fourth Amendment, or First Amendment is the freedom of speech. Fourth Amendment is the unlawful seizure and excessive force. So the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects plaintiffs' rights to be free from unlawful seizure and use of excessive force by the federal government, and the Fourth and 14th Amendments protect plaintiffs' rights to be free from unlawful seizures and use of excessive force by state and local. Defendants have routinely used excessive force and unreasonably seized people with disabilities, including plaintiffs, at protests. For example, defendants have repeatedly subjected plaintiffs to bull rushes, use of batons, tear gas, pepper balls, rubber bullets, and other crowd control munitions, even though plaintiffs pose no threat whatsoever, are suspected of no crime, or an extremely minor offense, and are not resisting lawful orders or fleeing. Indeed, many are actively trying to comply. Likewise, defendants' use of strobe lights triggers epileptic seizures in those with photosensitive epilepsy, but serves no law enforcement purpose other than to disorient protesters and stymie identification of officers. Defendants also subject people with disabilities to unreasonable seizures by, for example, traumatically separating people with disabilities from their service animals without cause, using unnecessarily tight handcuffs, failing to provide needed care while in custody, and other discriminatory practices. Defendants specifically target people with disabilities for violence in retaliation for their First Amendment right to free speech, including for requesting reasonable accommodations. Defendants' overwhelming use of force against and refusal to accommodate people with disabilities during seizures is unreasonable. The federal courts have inherent authority to grant injunctive relief to direct compliance of the federal government and individual federal officials with the Fourth Amendment. And then this goes into specific counts again, as Monell claims. This one is against the city, mayor, police chief, the county, the sheriff, and other local defendants. And this is going to be very similar to the last set of counts that we had before, where local defendants have a policy, practice, and custom of the 4th and 14th Amendment violations in this complaint. It's going to be, like I said, very similar, just to replace First Amendment violations with Fourth Amendment. Plaintiffs and others repeatedly provided local defendants direct notice of the 4th and 14th Amendment violations and the harm they were causing. Local defendant officials at all levels knew or should have known of the need to train and supervise those under their control to prevent the violations. They repeatedly failed to provide such training or supervision. The second count is towards Travis Hampton, which is on the state level for the Oregon State Police. And then the third count is for federal defendants, Chad Wolf and Donald Washington. Then there is a fourth count, which is the Bivens claim for Fourth Amendment violation against the federal defendants. And again, individual federal defendants acting under color of federal authority actively participate in the Fourth Amendment violations. Violations are so widespread and the resultant harm so obvious that the individual federal defendants who supervise others, including Wolf and Washington, knew or should have known of the need to train and supervise those under their control to prevent the violations, but they repeatedly failed to provide such training or supervision. And then we have the fifth claim for relief, which is Fifth Amendment. And this one is the Fifth Amendment claim here looks to be against the federal defendants in particular. And then the 14th Amendment towards the state and local. Defendants systematically deny due process to people with disabilities, including plaintiffs and others. Defendants have a policy, practice, and custom of not providing sufficient notice to people with disabilities to allow them to disperse or an opportunity to otherwise comply with lawful police orders before subjecting them to violence and arrest. For example, defendants do not give people with mobility-based disabilities adequate time to disperse, and defendants do not give people who are deaf or hard of hearing any notice on the need to disperse. Their failure to provide due process is not narrowly tailored to any compelling government interest. Failing to notify people who need to disperse, not providing sufficient time to do so, and then brutalizing people for their failure to comply only fuels public anger, intensifies the need for protests, and makes the public less safe. And again, federal courts have inherent authority to grant injunctive relief. And then again, we go through the Monell claims like we had on the other two allegations. This one on the local defendants, that they have a policy, practice, and custom of the 14th Amendment violations described. And it's so widespread that officials at all levels of local defendant agencies were aware and deliberately indifferent to. Plaintiffs and others repeatedly provide local defendants direct notice of the 14th Amendment violations. And they should have known of the need to train and supervise those under their control. The second count is against the state, the same thing as before, and the third count against federal defendants, much like before. And then again we have the Bivens claim against the federal defendants. That they acted under color of federal authority, actively participated in Fifth Amendment violations described in the complaint, and or were deliberately they were aware of and deliberately indifferent to the violations. And we have the sixth claim for relief. Right to equal protections under the 5th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. Defendants' policies, practices, and customs substantially burden people with disabilities in the exercises of their fundamental rights of freedom of speech to be free from unreasonable seizures and excessive force and to procedural due process. For example, defendants communicate orders to disperse and declarations of unlawful assembly or riot only to people who hear, denying protesters who are deaf or hard of hearing the ability to comply with defendants' orders before being subject to force and arrest. Unlike people who hear, people who are deaf or hard of hearing are therefore not provided the notice required by the 1st, 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendments, and are subjected to uses of force and unreasonable seizures to which people who hear are not subjected. Defendants know that people with disabilities are participating in the ongoing protests as members of the community, medics, and press. Defendants know that their current tactics disproportionately harm people with disabilities. They have been told too many times by too many people to claim otherwise. Their response has evinced a callous disregard for the rights of people with disabilities, consistently telling people with disabilities that if they cannot handle law enforcement tactics, including violence, that they should not be out protesting at all. This indicates institutional animus towards people with disabilities. Moreover, defendants have specifically targeted people with disabilities for violence in retaliation for exercising their First and 14th Amendment rights, including exercising the right to free speech by requesting reasonable accommodations, further demonstrating animus against people with disabilities. Defendants' actions do not survive strict scrutiny because they are not narrowly tailored to serve a compelling government interest. Defendants have no interest in discriminating against people with disabilities, targeting them, and denying them their constitutionally protected rights. And then, again, we go through the different counts for the Monell claim. First one against the city, which is basically, it's almost carbon copy of the other ones. Count 2 is against the state defendants, and count 3 against the federal defendants. And then we have count 4 as the Bivens claim against the federal defendants. And then finally we have the prayer for relief. Wherefore plaintiffs pray for the following relief: a declaration that defendants' alleged conduct has violated and continues to violate Title II of the ADA, 42 U.S.C. Code 12131 et sequitur, and its implementing regulations, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and its implementing regulations, and the First, Fourth, Fifth, and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Preliminary and permanent orders enjoining defendants, their agents, employees, successors, and all other persons acting in active concert or participation with defendants from violating Title II of the ADA and its implementing regulations, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and its implementing regulations, and the First, Fourth, Fifth, and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. Preliminary and permanent orders requiring defendants to cease discriminatory practices against individuals with disabilities at protests and provide reasonable modifications, including but not limited to modify use of force policies to address the needs of people with disabilities and or their service animals, including but not limited to ceasing use of force such as impact munitions, flashbang grenades, batons, shoving, and other types of force and tactics unless necessary for officer safety based on the immediate threat of serious harm from an individual. And I want to sidestep for a moment to remind that we just had last week Judge Hernandez out of the same federal court upheld contempt violations or contempt motion on 3 different counts against the city for using force in situations where there was not an immediate threat of harm to officer safety. 2 of them were attributed directly to Officer Brett Taylor. The 3rd one, we don't know who for certain it was. Let's see. Use the least amount of force possible against people with disabilities and their assistants, interpreters, sighted guides, and or service animals. Cease using chemical munitions that negatively affect people with respiratory and inflammatory disabilities and that negatively affect service animals, and remove remaining residue from areas where used. Remember, we had so much tear gas used that downtown at the Justice Center, it was getting up several stories to where the air intake vents are for the Justice Center jail. And all that stuff settled down onto the ground and sat there for weeks. And just you could walk through there in the middle of the day, and if you weren't out there used to tear gas already, you needed like a gas mask or something heavier duty than just the masks that people are normally wearing for COVID. Cease using strobe lights. Provide ASL interpreters and visual messaging systems to convey orders or other directions to people who are deaf or hard of hearing at protests. Provide adequate time and clear and consistent directions for individuals with disabilities to comply with lawful orders. Before dispersing a crowd or taking other actions that may place people with disabilities in danger, identify and inform protesters and others of accessible avenues of escape. Remember, when they're doing dispersals, at that point they're really not worried about arresting people unless they can point out this person is doing this thing wrong and it's serious enough to warrant an arrest on the spot. If it's minor stuff, just let them go. You just want them gone from the scene. Stop separating people with disabilities from their assistants, interpreters, sighted guides, and or service animals. Ensure access to proper medical treatment, including medication. This has been a huge ongoing issue. Cease practices that aggravate people's psychiatric disabilities or trigger PTSD responses, such as misgendering people, refusing to house people in defendant's custody according to their gender identity, subjecting people to unnecessary body searches, and or refusing to use staff of a different gender to carry out body searches when requested, and award compensatory and punitive damages as may be allowed under the laws set forth above. Also, an order awarding plaintiffs' attorney fees, expenses, and costs provided by law, and such other and further relief as the court may deem just and proper. This case was first filed on November 1st, so it's been just over a month now. And there is definitely a lot of traffic that's been happening with this particular case that I'm going to be watching this case particularly closely because of, for selfish reasons, because of, the fact that I'm disabled myself. These issues have had an effect on me and have definitely chilled my ability to do things to where I've gone and made changes in how I handle my work with reporting. To begin with, when I was out in the early days, I'd be out at night and things were so chaotic, so many, flashbangs, pepper balls, people running and screaming. It triggered my own disabilities bad enough that I would end up, home for a week, beating myself up that I wasn't able to be on the ground like everybody else, while I'm scrambling to get gear to try to protect myself. My first night out recording, it was just me and a stick with a GoPro, and then the next time I was out, I had a helmet with press markings on it to try to identify. I'm not out here as a protester, I'm not doing anything that the police should see as even remotely at risk to them. And I say that knowing that the vast majority of protesters are not doing illegal acts. And the ones that are, most of them are very minor things. But this happened time and again, and as I've kept saying, I never had fear of protesters doing anything to hurt me. It was always the cops that I was worried about. My biggest fear is, or was exactly what happened to Juniper in this. One of the issues I do have shoulder issues. If I was handcuffed for hours, I would be in excruciating pain because of a shoulder issue that I can't have my hands behind my back for more than a minute. So the idea of being arrested, not having my walker, not being able to keep my balance, arms forced behind me, and likely being misgendered on purpose just because some cop gets their jollies off on it, that was the biggest fear that I have. You know, and I've had injuries as a result of being out documenting protests. But that's still the one thing that never did happen to me is still my biggest fear, and it's one of the reasons why I've ended up switching my focus to documenting daytime stuff, especially, you know, with all the legal stuff going on. So, but yeah, I know this has been 2.5 hours now, and those of you who have been here for this and are putting up with me through this whole thing, I thank you very much for the time that you've spent here. If you want to, I would definitely appreciate if you'd be able to hit the subscribe button. I do want to try to get up to enough subscribers that I can get a dedicated URL for the channel here. Make it easier to find later. If you do want to do some financial support, which, you know, I definitely appreciate it, but I know a lot of people, you know, a lot of people need help. A lot of people are not able to help, and I can totally understand that. If you're able to, Venmo, Cash App, they're both Raindrop Works PDX. If you go to our website, Raindrop Works, you know, there's articles and such there that we've been working on. Feel free to read up and share. Let other people know what all's going on here. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and let you all go, and take care. Be safe. Or be dangerous.